This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. How does it feel when you hear someone deliver words that you wrote and it's a hit?
Well, when you've written it and it's delivered by somebody else, in a sense, you've imagined it in their voice for a while, and so to be the speechwriter is to be in a way like the doctor who's helping to deliver the baby. You're there to help, and you're there to make sure the baby arrives there safely, but the baby belongs to the mother, and so all credit goes to the mother, to the parents, to the people who actually do the work. So it's gratifying, but it's what you do professionally. You don't feel necessarily a strong personal, sort of surge of emotion like you do when you're a parent. You're there to help, and you're there to help somebody, do something which they might have struggled with in the past, and which hopefully it's done well. You see the audience reacts. You feel very good about it. It means that you guessed correctly about a few things, but you don't feel a sense of ownership the way you would if you yourself were speaking.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Noam Neusner. He's a former presidential speechwriter and a senior-level communicator and speechwriter at 30 Point Communications in Washington, D.C. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Noam about speechwriting, about what it's like to craft words for others, and about what it's like to write speeches for the President of the United States. Behind just about every historic speech by someone who made history was a good speechwriter, a ghostwriter, someone who crafts words for others to speak, where others get credit for the words and those memorable phrases. Some speechwriters are well known, others are practically anonymous, but all of the good ones have found a way to produce a tightly written and effective speech that at the same time makes sure that the speech is original to the person delivering it, that the thoughts are those of the speaker, that the speech is from the speaker. This is the balance that every good speechwriter seeks to achieve. Noam Neusner is a veteran speechwriter and a senior-level communicator. He's got decades of experience in the private sector, the U.S. government, and as a journalist, and he's authored 4 books. During this time, he served as the economic and domestic policy speechwriter for President George W. Bush. He managed communications and media relations for the Office of Management and Budget, and before that, he was a journalist at U.S. News and World Report, Bloomberg News, and the Tampa Tribune. Noam, you've done many things, but the common thread in all of them has been writing. What attracted you to life as a writer?
I don't imagine that I thought of myself ever as anything but a writer. From a very young age, due to the fact that my father was a professor and a very prolific writer himself, and and he came up as a child through journalism. My grandparents were journalists. I always expressed myself fully in the written form. It still is the primary means by which I work out my thinking. Writing to me is a very natural habit. No different than in what people do, whatever they do, whether it's, not breathing per se, but, whatever people do to express themselves personally. It's just how I've always thought and how I've always acted. And so, early in my academic life, my life in school, in grade school, middle school, the teachers who had the most profound effect on me were always the teachers who paid attention to my writing, took it seriously, were not easily impressed by tricks. They could see when I was trying to pull one over on them, with cleverness. So they would always push me a little harder. And so through writing did I learn how to think. Through writing did I learn how to weigh evidence. Through writing did I learn how to convince people of the merit of an idea, and sometimes even to convince people of the merits of their ideas. But I never thought of myself as anything other than a writer, even though professionally that process took a few more years to work out.
Well, you mentioned your father, and I think for our listeners, I thought I'd ask you, can you tell us who your father was, especially as a writer?
Sure. My dad is Professor and Rabbi Jacob Neusner. He passed away in 2016. For his entire adult life, he was a scholar in Judaism and in Judaic studies, a field which really didn't exist in the Western academic canon when he earned his own PhD. He spent his entire career working around classical rabbinic texts like the Talmud, the Mishnah, Tosefta, as well as contemporary Jewish issues of Jewish life and Jewish community and Jewish learning. He was the writer and editor of more than 900 books. I think at his death, he was the most prolific writer in the English language in history. He set an amazing example, watching him close up of productivity focus. He set a high bar, but he also encouraged me to find my own way. And though I occasionally, had him review my work, I generally steered away from that because he had different standards than I did. I was focused on more of a journalistic treatment of in writing, and he was more scholarly in his approach.
When you wrote for the President of the United States, was he proud of you?
Sure. My dad was. I think he was always proud of the work I was doing. When I was working for President George W. Bush, I had the opportunity to introduce him to my dad, my parents, and President Bush was very gracious. He's always been very gracious, and he said to my dad, he said, "We're very glad to have Noam on our team. He makes a very helpful contribution," which I think he might have said about anybody. But then he turned to my mother and he said, "Now," he pointed at my mother and he said, "Now, Noam, I want you to listen to your mother because I have to listen to mine." And so he had that observation as well. Now and actually later my dad actually briefed the president in I think 2007. I think President Bush was going to either go to Rome or receive the Pope Benedict, and he met with a number of experts in Pope Benedict and in Pope Benedict's thinking here in the United States. And so my dad happened to have been friendly on warm terms with Pope Benedict before he became the Pope. When he was Cardinal Ratzinger. Cardinal Ratzinger was a scholar himself and took a deep interest in my dad's writing about early Christianity and the Judaism of that time. And so the two of them had a longstanding academic and scholarly relationship. And so my dad came in and gave President Bush a sense of Pope Benedict as a thinking man's Pope, I guess. So they had their own independent relationship, which I was very proud to support.
Well, you mentioned George W. Bush and your work with him. How many speechwriters did the president have when you were on staff?
Well, we had I think 6. The staff had a very clear structure. There were 3 sort of what I'd call, there were 3 speechwriters sort of at the tip of the spear. We had a chief speechwriter named Mike Gerson and 2 assistants to the president, or I should say deputy assistants. One was Matt Scully and one was John McConnell. The 3 of them worked closely together when I was there and did outstanding work on pretty much every major speech the president gave. Everything that I wrote, everything that all of my other colleagues wrote, they first went through Mike, John, and Matt before they went on to a larger review process. And they had the most experience working with the president from before in the campaign, and they had a very close relationship with him and certainly knew how he liked things. So that was actually quite helpful because for somebody like myself who hadn't had those experiences, it meant that we had the confidence of knowing that it went through a screening process and often an improvement process. There were a few other speechwriters who floated around We had somebody who would typically focus on national security issues. My focus was on domestic policy issues, primarily the economy and sort of domestic policy issues like healthcare and energy, sometimes the environment. We had other speechwriters from time to time, some who had special focus on education and issues of the faith community. We had people who might have been attached to other offices, but who did speeches for the president when it came to issues around trade. And so you had a nice bunch. And then we had, in addition to the speechwriters, we had a couple of researchers, a few fact checkers. We usually had a couple of interns. One of our interns, Chris Michel, was such a great find and such an outstanding writer that we hired him after his graduation, and he stayed on for a few more years, and he eventually became the chief speechwriter to President Bush, and was a very good muse for the president. He was really an outstanding writer and really connected well with the president.
That's interesting you mentioned muse, because that was actually tied to the next question I was going to ask you, and that is, how did you work with President Bush on his speeches? Because I know that some people that are public figures or civic leaders or corporate leaders, they don't really meet with their speechwriters that often. They meet with their second in command, and that's who is sort of their in-between. But other people like to get to know their speechwriter and have their speechwriter get to know them very well. What was it like to work with President Bush in that way?
Yeah, he definitely did like to have us involved. And for me personally, that meant being part of the policy process as an observer. When issues were being developed for presidential policy making, when he was going to announce a new initiative on the economy or on healthcare, we wouldn't be thinking about the speech per se, but we would be imagining it. We'd be thinking about what would be the speech's primary goals, what would be and how they would align with the policy. And so in the case of my White House experience, I got to work very closely with the president's chief advisors on those domestic policy matters. And as issues were starting to really filter up to the level where it would get presidential attention, they would bring me in on the process. And that was very much by design. It wasn't because I asked to. It was because there was an expectation that speechwriting would play a critical role in policymaking. Now, that's not always the case. Often speechwriters are, in political settings, are seen as finishers, sort of the people who beautify the policy. But that's not how the Bush administration typically handled things. Speechwriting was treated quite seriously and on a content basis. So I would work closely with the policymakers, and and our communications people as well, and we would think about how the president would sound, what would make the best possible argument, what would be some of the key language that we would want to use, what phrasing would make sense, what phrasing would have the most impact to the audiences that we needed to reach. These were all very, very in-depth and meaty discussions. And there were times when the president himself was certainly involved in these discussions too. And I remember very clearly on a matter, I think it related to Medicare, and we were discussing the Medicare Part D, the Medicare Drug Act, which introduced Medicare coverage to prescriptions for seniors. And in that particular case, we would be discussing a whole matter of policy, costs and how this would work and so forth. And I'd be sitting in the back row of the Roosevelt room, just taking notes, just, listening, trying to see what would sort of be a good material for a speech when we would actually announce this thing. And every so often the president would hear an argument that he liked, and he'd sort of point his thumb at me and say, "Hey, get that. I want to use that." And so I, usually had a sense for that. And so luckily I would just jump, right in and have the notes ready for that. And that would actually help me a great deal because it would strengthen my own efforts to lock down certain material in a speech.
These reforms are the act of a vibrant and compassionate government. We show our concern for the dignity of our seniors by giving them quality health care. We show our respect for seniors by giving them more choices and more control over their decision making. We're putting individuals in charge of their healthcare decisions. And as we move to modernize and reform other programs of this government, we will always trust individuals and their decisions and put personal choice at the heart of our efforts.
So, for example, if I thought something was if I needed a paragraph or two on a specific matter in the speech, and I felt like I didn't have the backup for it, if I didn't have enough research, if I didn't have enough support to make the statements, but if I knew the president wanted to say something, I would press very, very hard behind it so that we could deliver if provided that everything was going to check out. Now, that helped me because when somebody was dragging their feet for whatever reason, they had other demands on their time, I could say, look, the president said, I heard it in a policy time, the president said he'd like to make this point. So let's see whether we can actually deliver for him. And in a very non-threatening way, that tended to move the wheels that we needed to move to get things done. And and at that point, once the speech was taking shape, it was a matter of iterations. I mean, I would do an initial draft. It would go to our triumvirate of outstanding speechwriters. They would review it, make changes, suggest changes, ask for things. I would take those changes. I would smooth things out. I would deliver hopefully what they needed me to deliver, and then it would go through an entire process of staff review, which is quite customary in every White House, hopefully. And then I would take those edits from various people and integrate them into the draft. Generally speaking, with very rare times would I reject a change. The reason being that changes were requested or demanded only when absolutely necessary. Again, if somebody thought of themselves as a speechwriter and they weren't on the speechwriting staff and they were just suggesting things that sort of caught their ear as kind of clever or cute, we would just say, look, we want to respect all edits that come to us. Is this something that you feel will increase the accuracy or the power of the speech, or is this something that just sounded good to you? And usually they would quickly relent and they'd say, oh, no. I guess, because I would always say, if necessary, I'm happy to bring up your edits with the president. And that kind of caught their attention that maybe they should, just throw out edits that were sort of, just on the fly, flying by the seat of the pants kind of stuff. So the at the end of the process, from the point of view of everything before it gets to the president, it was pretty well buttoned down, and then it would go to him. And at that point, anything could happen. And while I think the speech process often worked quite well, he would often make meaningful changes and demands to the speech because he knew what would work, what wouldn't work. He had a very good sense for how things would sound on the stump. He's the guy who delivers the speeches, and he looks out into the crowd, and when he's reading something and he's framing an argument and he sees people responding to him emotionally, he knows it works. And when it doesn't, he also knows it doesn't. And so he has a very good sense of how something can sometimes sound good on a piece of paper, but not sound good from the stump. And in that process, of the review process, you could and would be called into the Oval Office at any given time, usually in the morning, first thing. And so for me, that meant waking up even a little bit earlier, and getting to my desk no later than 6:30, and being ready to go, no matter what happened, at basically 5 to 7. That's when the president would usually arrive at the Oval Office. He would have reviewed some things. He would be reviewing some things. He typically reviewed his speeches first thing in the morning. He would do it with a Sharpie. I would get called in if necessary for stuff that I had worked on. I'd bring my own draft of the speech, and then he'd run through his changes. And and sometimes he'd just circle things and say, we sure about that? Is that accurate? Can you check that? It sounds too good to be true. Or he'd say, this paragraph doesn't work. I remember him crossing out a whole paragraph, and I said, Mr. President, that's the applause line. And he just turned to me and goes, no, it's not. And that was it. So he obviously knew what would work and what wouldn't work, and I had to tip my hat to him on that. And then, it was a matter of rushing back to my desk and making all the changes so that he had a clean version of the draft of the speech as soon as possible without delay. And then, that conversation usually took place for a major speech, a week or two before the speech was to be given. For something a little bit more prosaic, it would be something that would occur maybe 2 days before it was to be given. And every so often, it was the morning of the speech. So, when he was hot to trot on issues of domestic policy, I got to see him a lot. I guess he got to see me a lot. I don't know who got the better of that deal. I think I did. And then when, let's say, other issues were more front and center, when I was there, the war in Iraq was certainly occupying a lot of his attention and energy. At that point, I would typically be fade away from his attention, and I would be working on issues, and typically wouldn't have to come into the Oval Office for anything.
Were there any words or phrases that he liked to use that always had to be in his scripts?
I wouldn't say there were words or phrases, but there were phrasings. The president preferred saying things in the positive rather than the negative. He liked sentences that had very distinct clipped sound. So he would go for sentences that were brief, that were packed with action verbs, that had very few what I would call curly cues at the end. He was not somebody who would say on the one hand and on the other hand. He would use, he didn't like using the word I and me. He was very much opposed to self-referentialism, and so he tended to remove himself in any way from the speech as sort of as an actor in a speech. He was giving the speech, that was it. There was also an emphasis, and this wasn't just from him, but others on the staff, that the language that he would use should be presidential in nature. And I don't really know what that means, but as with things of that type, you kind of know it when you see it, or you certainly know it when you don't see it. And so we always thought and remembered that the president's words were always recorded fully and would show up in a nicely bound leather volume that would sit in the National Archives and libraries around the world for all time to come. And you wanted to make sure the language was as official sounding as possible. Didn't mean that we had to use a lot of highfalutin language, far from it, but we wanted it to be clear and direct. And while the president certainly favored language that was close to the ear, that was close to the vernacular of a normal American, he didn't want his language to sound casual. And I think that's the tough balance to strike, but I think we found it. I think in some of his greatest speeches, the simplicity of his language, the accessibility of the language. It's very easy to read one of his best speeches because they're so clear and the language is so light that's when his speeches were their best. And so, unfortunately, I was writing speeches that had to do with tax policy and Medicare and environmental regulations, and that made it a little bit tougher. I didn't have the material that necessarily lent itself to simplicity, but he actually was really good at it. He knew what would work for people, and he had a sense for framing an idea in a way that was likely to register with people. Language that was colorful and physical, what you'd call picture words. He preferred those to the sort of high Latinate words that people in Washington love to use, but really nobody really understands.
How would you characterize his perceptions of his own abilities?
Well, it's interesting. He actually, I think when history called on him to deliver a speech that would have power and meaning, he did deliver. And I think as time passes, people will appreciate those remarks more and more. I've often been found very, very humorous to see some of my friends who are Democrats and liberals, quoting Bush, with great credit and an honor on issues where he takes positions that they suddenly find themselves in agreement on. And his language actually, is quite appealing. He's very direct. I think he gave a speech at the opening of the National Museum of African American History, And he said, "Great nations don't hide their secrets. They don't run away from their flaws." And it was just a perfect phrase. And you know, that's how he thinks, and I think it actually works quite well.
Great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and corrects them.
There were times when he would step back away from this particular speech and he would focus on his approach. And so let me talk through that a little bit. The first point that he would often make is that every speech is a chance to educate. He did this very often. He would say, "Look, all of you in this room," and this is, he would be pointing to everybody. "All of you in this room take for granted that everyone understands all the issues here and understands why we should be doing what we're doing, and understands the problem and understands why this particular policy makes sense. Don't assume that. I have to say it, and I have to say it over and over again in order to make sure that people are willing to follow our ideas and our policies through legislation. We cannot assume that people understand the problem that we understand." And so he would say, educate every audience. Take the time. Explain not just what we think, but why we think it. And that was pretty good guidance. And I've found that guidance really works in every environment. Everyone takes for granted that their audience knows as much as they do, and they're wrong. And so he understood that, which I thought was very good. Now, of course, there were moments where everyone understood the events clearly and had no problem, arriving to the speech fully informed and ready for whatever message he was to bring. And on those moments, I thought he was quite good too. He didn't over-explain events on 9/11, but he did say, after 9/11, "Why do these people hate us so much?" And he did a really good job of explaining exactly what it was why Al Qaeda hated us so much.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They see right here in this chamber a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other.
And so he was good at that. The other piece is that he believed very strongly in a strong structure for a speech. And he outlined this to me, I think, the second or third speech I wrote for him. He called me in. The speech was fine. It was like the third or fourth most important speech he was giving that day. So he wasn't calling me in to talk about the speech. He was calling me in because he wanted to take my measure and give me kind of an extra 10 minutes of attention that he felt I needed. And he said, "Look, Noam, I like my speeches to have a very straightforward structure. I like to start by explaining the problem, because if people don't understand the problem, nothing else is going to work. And then I like to talk about our principles. What are the ideas that we bring to the problem? What is the way that we think about the problem? What is our worldview? Okay. And then I want you to bring forward the policy, the solution. So you start with the problem, you move forward to the principles, then you have the policy, the solution. And you can't jump to the solution. You have to explain the first two parts first." And I thought that was a pretty valuable structure to follow. And I think it probably appeals to any English teacher out there. It's easy to remember. And as it happens, it's a pretty straightforward approach to all forms of argumentative writing of any kind, whether speeches or otherwise. And so that was his preference. And so sometimes his speeches did have a certain workmanlike quality, where it was doing a job, and it wasn't meant to be chiseled on marble at some sort of great museum somewhere. He didn't mind that. He was perfectly comfortable to leave the marble chiseling to others. He wanted his speeches to do work. And that meant that sometimes we had to give up an artful phrase or a nice little touch, because he didn't want to seem flowery.
You mentioned that George W. Bush liked to start out with a problem, but I know that there were some speeches where, and these weren't your serious speeches like 9/11, but other times where he liked to start off with a joke or something humorous. How would you characterize his use of humor and how you had to incorporate humor into the speeches you wrote?
Humor is one of the toughest ones to do. I was never good at producing good jokes and good material for the president. There was something about the combination of he liked corny humor, and he enjoyed making a joke that seemed, kind of like a dad joke. He had quite a few of those that he would use from time to time, and we didn't necessarily write them into his remarks. We just kind of knew he would use them. He Even if he bought into a joke, his jokes really had to be written by a skilled joke writer. And we actually had somebody who had written for President Reagan and had written for a number of the leading Republicans around Washington, that written some of their humorous jokes, the humorous material for like the Al Smith dinner and the White House Correspondents' Dinner and things like that. But there are, Scully in particular, Matt was very good at writing humor. And I think there's something about somebody who can do that, which is a special, it's a nice treasure. It was never a strength of mine. And, and if somebody said we need some humor here, I wouldn't throw my hands up. I'd give my best effort, but nothing I wrote ever, I think, made it. I mean, I think maybe there were 2 or 3 jokes he used in the 2 or 3 years that I worked for him.
That's funny. I remember working for one multinational company, and it had a very charismatic CEO he was actually so charming that employees would line up to get his autograph after employee meetings. And one of the things he always did was open up with a funny story or joke. And if you listen to enough of this person's speeches, I'd say he had about 25 jokes. And if you listen to enough of them, you would hear the same joke a second time.
Yeah.
And you started to know this. But I worked with his speechwriter. We worked pretty closely together. And one of the things I learned from that when I wrote speeches is how humor can be a nice icebreaker in the beginning, but you have to be, like you said, you have to be careful with that. So what I've learned to do is not really write a joke where you expect a laugh, but write sort of a humorous anecdote or story, and to build it so that there's not this awkward pause if no one laughs. It's It's one of those things, but it's always good then whenever you write in, like you said, that applause line or that little bit of a pause for an audience reaction, and he gets it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that when you're writing for the president, and I think this is probably true of a lot of prominent individuals, if they buy into the joke and it's a solid effort and it's not labored, people will laugh. People generally laugh on behalf of the president. And I think audiences want to enjoy a decent joke from the president, even people who perhaps don't share his political worldview. It's particularly when it's when they're pointing fun at themselves and they're not being mean or in any way demeaning to others.
I cannot help but note that a huge influence in my teenage years is honored here, the great Chuck Berry. Or my baseball idol, growing up in far west Texas, the great Willie Mays. And of course, something I never really mastered, the ability to give a good speech, but Thurgood Marshall sure could.
The humor has to be authentic. You can't write a great joke for somebody that doesn't have a touch of humor in their bodies. People just have to either have it in them, or they just have to be themselves and not try to tell any jokes.
Well, George W. Bush had a very self-deprecating sense of humor, didn't he?
He did, and he does. He's outstanding. He's got a great. Also, he's got a certain physicality too. If you ever watch President Bush give a speech, he's got sort of a deadpan way to drop a line. He's got a good way to sort of take somebody. Let's say if he's doing a Q&A, he takes somebody by the hand as he's leading to a joke. He guides them along. He's got the sort of a nice quality, like a grandfather telling a good funny story. And just wait here, listen to this. And he does it really, really well. And I think also, people realize that, especially now, that he's got a certain warmth to him that perhaps they missed out when he was president because they were so upset about something that he was trying to do with the country. But they see how he interacts with other world leaders even now, and certainly with the Obamas. He could have easily been bitter about how some of those things went, but I think he's actually turned away from bitterness, because his natural self is to be sunny and optimistic. He's somebody who generally tries to look at the best side of people and work with them on that.
Well, I couldn't finish this podcast without asking you if you were to give any advice to anyone who wanted to be a speechwriter or someone that was just preparing for a big speech of their own. What advice would you give them?
Well, for people who want to become a speechwriter, a couple of things come to mind. For one thing, write as much as you can. Writing is I had never written a speech before I got to the White House. And I mean, I had to do a sample speech for the White House, but I didn't have any speech writing tactical skills. I didn't know some of the things that all speechwriters know, from training. But I knew how to write, and hopefully write simply and clearly about issues that were complex, and that kind of put me in line to do the next part of my education as a speechwriter. The other thing I think is I think I would pay very close attention to the type of things you read. From a content point of view, if you're interested in political speech writing, you should be reading a lot of history. And you should be aware not only of American history, but the history of other important democracies, and also not just democracies, but obviously totalitarian regimes where speeches could be used for ill. But public speaking has always been one of the most effective means of democratic action. And wherever your political views are, if you are ignorant of the great speeches of the 20th century and the 21st, but also speeches from the ancient period, you have your education is short. It's deprived, and you need that grounding to understand. To understand how people have been transformed, how ideas have become activated through powerful speeches. I spent a great deal of my time when I arrived at the White House just reading former speeches by President Kennedy, President Roosevelt, FDR, President Teddy Roosevelt, Truman, certainly Reagan, the great ones. And there's no substitute for that. Also, writing that doesn't have to do anything with politics and history, but I would recommend reading poetry, or at least poets that work for you. I found that reading, and I still find that reading, a poem or two by William Butler Yeats, tends to clean up my mind a bit. It tends to sort of give me a grounding in language that is just crystallized and perfect, and each word counts for something. And so even if you never want to write poetry, being sensitive to it is something a speechwriter should become familiar with. Peggy Noonan said that writing for radio with Dan Rather really helped prepare her for her work in the Reagan White House, and I'm sure that was true because she was writing for the ear. And poetry is meant for the ear. I would imagine that if somebody has written, let's say they wrote lyrics for their a high school band, they actually probably know more about speech writing in many ways than maybe their peers who read the New York Times every day. The reason is they understand how a single word can just capture an emotion, and that's pretty powerful. In terms of giving speeches, look, it's not just about the writing, it's about the stagecraft, it's about being comfortable in your own skin. But the most important thing is to prepare. Some people really don't like reading a speech, and those people are wise to know that, because I can guarantee you their audience doesn't want to be read a speech by that same person. And that's fine, but you have to still have a plan, and you have to know what you're going to say, and you have to have a really good sense of your own ability to say what you want to say and say no more. It's hard. Those are skills, and it really does not come naturally. People who are naturally good public speakers are never actually naturally good public speakers. They've just worked hard at it. They've imitated, they've stolen, they've taken the time, they've studied what others do. All great public speakers, all of them, have learned to do what they do by virtue of a lot of practice, repetition, and importantly, they've studied the great ones. So, and of course, they've made it their own, but they ultimately have spent the time. It's just like any skill, any sport, anything like that.
You mentioned William Butler Yeats. Is there any particular poem that he wrote that sticks out for you that you could recite?
Oh no, I can't. But the poem of his that still sort of when I open it, he's got a few poems that I go to a lot. One is about the Irish Rebellion. I think it's April. It's called April 1916. There you go. And that one I studied in college, and I remember it particularly well, powerfully, because my professor Hugh Kenner read it, and he had a beautiful brogue, and he read it with such emotion. You really felt the full gravity and the sense of loss of life. Still, I mean, Yeats was certainly an Irish patriot, but he understood the cost of war, and he expressed it, I think, really, really powerfully in that poem. And then there's a poem that Yeats wrote about holding his daughter, I think it was a daughter, through a storm. And, inside the house and outside the house, the branches are bending, and there's danger all about. And I think I remember reading it when I myself was a new father, and I remember relating to what he was expressing, which was this sense of what a father must do, which is to potentially protect their children from harm. And there have been other poems of his that have touched me over the years, but none. I unfortunately I have not spent the time that I should, and I've pledged to do, to memorize his poetry.
Noam Neusner, thank you for joining us today.
Tim, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
To learn more about Noam Neusner and his work and some of the stories we talked about today, see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion. Or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook group that you can join, a Facebook page you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.